Now, as part of the 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech and the Civil Rights March on Washington this week, Republicans have been out in full force talking about, no, Martin Luther King, he believed in the right-wing ideas of personal responsibility. He would have been disgusted by the civil rights leaders. Now, my favorite is when they say, like, oh, man, if he knew Jesse Jackson, he wouldn't like him at all. See, here's the thing. He did know Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was one of his better friends, at least within the movement. So, oops. Okay. Now, when you get to the issue of personal responsibility, though, you got to understand, God, it sounds so good. And to me, like, how do you argue with it? I don't want to argue with it. I agree with it. Like, should you have personal responsibility? Everybody, of course you should, right? Now, the Republicans use this all the time, but they don't quite mean what you think they mean. Now, first, let me give you a quote from Mitt Romney, who, of course, famously said this during the campaign. It wound up hurting him. About this was part of the 47% quote, and the people who live off the government. And he said to his rich donor friends, quote, "I'll never convince them," referring to the 47% he says is living off the government, "they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives." In other words, they're bums. They're living off of us. If only they would take personal responsibility, everything would be fine. Now, Joe Walsh, a former congressman from Illinois, Tea Party guy, he was one of the most radical guys in Congress and lost his reelection effort, and he now does a radio show. So he decided that he was going to use the 50th anniversary to hit this personal responsibility theme again and do it in his usual obnoxious way. He made a long list on his website of all the different ways of new dream that he has for African American people. Oh, great. Black folks in this country couldn't wait to hear what Joe Walsh thinks they should do. And now here's the last three that he had on his list. He said, "I have a dream that today's black leadership will quit blaming racism and the system for what ails black America." Now, this is very standard. Bill O'Reilly's been saying it for a long time. Just get over it, okay? If somebody shoots you because you happen to be getting out of your car in your own driveway because of your race, get over it. Somebody throws a bleach bomb, whatever it might be, hundreds of thousands of different examples. Who cares? Just get over it. Stop basically saying it's the victim's fault for not getting over the attacks against them, right? And by the way, my favorite example of that is the resume one, where same exact resume, word for word, but an African-American sounding name versus a white sounding name. The white sounding name gets callbacks at a 50% higher rate. Well, if you can't get a job because they think your name sounds black, it's hard to get over it because you didn't get the job. I mean, I want to do personal responsibility. I want to take the action. I got a good resume. You got a callback when it's a white guy's name on that same resume. Now, if I don't have that chance, that opportunity, how can I exercise the personal responsibility? But that's not what they want you to do. They want you to ignore the problem. Now, Walsh continues, "I have a dream that black America will take responsibility for improving their own lives." Okay? So here we go again with the personal responsibility theme. I'm going to get to that in 1 second. Finally, of course, he's got to take it over the top, and he says, "I have a dream that one day black America will cease their dependency on the government plantation, which has enslaved them to the lives of poverty, and instead depend on themselves, their families, their churches, and their communities." Now, the plantation talk is, of course, obnoxious, but the latter half of that is what a lot of conservatives cling to. Man, if they just depended on themselves. Well, I had Professor Jody Armour in here as a professor at USC Law School, and I just talked to him yesterday. Really interesting interview, again, about this 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And he made a great point about this whole mythology of personal responsibility that I wanted to share with you guys. Let's watch.
Personal responsibility is the shibboleth of the right. You know, it is their main cudgel that they look to bludgeon people with, all right? You don't go down that road. You recognize that social factors, you're proof, Mr. President. You impeach the logic of the father needing to be in the home because you're the president of the United States without a father in the home. What you had was material support. You had people who cared about you with resources, who could help you along, and you took advantage. So recognize those external factors, those macro level factors as where the real issue is, not these internal deficiency factors.
So there's two really interesting points there. First, he's talking about the president, because he's right, the president does it as well. President Obama, as you know, Professor Armour is going to explain in a second, will often go and give speeches where he says, look, black folks, you need to take personal responsibility. And the whole thing about family values, et cetera, and you got to have the father in the home. But if he wanted to, he could actually take on that right-wing paradigm and say, wait, I didn't have a father in the home, but I did have material support. I had my grandparents' help. I went to, the best school in Honolulu, and I went to all these good schools. And look, Professor Armour went to Harvard too, but he did not come from a privileged upbringing at all. His father was set up, as he explained in the interview, got 22 to 55 years for marijuana. 5 years later, he became a lawyer inside of prison and proved that he was innocent, okay? But certainly Professor Armour didn't come from privileged background, but he's saying, look, what helped me was I got an opportunity through a government program that found kids like me and gave me a chance. So to say that the government has a plantation is an excuse for not doing anything. Now, you can argue that some government programs are not as efficient, don't help as much. In fact, they might even be counterproductive. That's a perfectly legitimate argument. But to say that the government shouldn't do anything, that we collectively together shouldn't do anything, and that when we see poor people, we should just throw bootstraps at them and go, do it yourself, take personal responsibility. That defies logic, and it defies the reality of what is in America. It doesn't mean that once you provide that bridge of opportunity, that people don't need to take personal responsibility. Of course they do. But if they don't have the bridge, if they go to take personal responsibility, how do they do it? I mean, look, I know this for a fact because of my own personal experience. My dad was an olive farmer in southeastern Turkey. He took a ton of personal responsibility and he wound up living the American dream. But he couldn't have done it if he didn't get a free education. And back then in Turkey, if you scored in the top 15% of the national test, when you go to college, you would get a free education. He had no money. If he hadn't gotten that bridge of opportunity, right now he would have been an olive farmer and I would have been an olive farmer near the Syrian border. It's one thing to say just personal responsibility, but that's obvious. It's another thing to use it as an excuse to not do anything because the reality is you're greedy and you don't want to help anybody else. And all you want to do is blame the victims. Now, again, Professor Armour points out the president is also guilty of this in his own speeches as well. He explains that here.
And the president himself, whenever he talks to Morehouse or anybody else, even today, he wags his finger self-righteously at a lot of lower-class blacks and says, fathers need to be in the home. Well, he didn't have a father in the home and it didn't hurt him. He's the president of the United States. What has to be in the home is some economic support like he was getting from his grandparents, going to the best school in Honolulu, and then to Columbia, and then to Harvard. Then you don't have to necessarily have a father in the home, you just have to have the support. And so but he makes the noises that the far right wants to hear. I used to think he was just throwing a sop to the Fox crew, but I think he actually believes it.
So another good point there. Look, this is not just a matter of race. This is true of African Americans who have internalized this. Some of them have. Now, Professor Armour thinks it's middle class and upper class blacks that often turn their backs and say, well, hey, listen, man, I made it out. Well, then it's your personal responsibility to make it out on your own. No, it's all of our responsibility to help one another as decent human beings. It doesn't mean that every government program is right, and it doesn't mean that you're supposed to just, in the right-wing mythology, just give your money to people. It means you build a bridge so they've got a fighting chance.